Good evening, I'm Martin Farr, co-chair of Insight's Public Lectures, and as ever, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to our latest programme, which I'd rather be doing in person, but you know why I can't, and the entire semester's programme will be in this format, so live on our YouTube channel, and thereafter on the YouTube channel, and also on our webpage as an archived lecture, so do pass on the links if you've enjoyed this evening's and future lectures. The website is a new innovation, and throughout the summer we've had lectures on the website. We've revived some of our lectures from the past, and we've recorded some virtual lectures. So there's a whole new archive of information and lectures that you can listen to and watch at your leisure. This evening's lecture is by Professor Shahidha Bari, and it's called Dressed: How to Think About Clothes. And at the end of it, I'll reappear for a question and answer session. So during the lecture and after the lecture, if you'd like to submit a question for Shahidha, please do so via the YouTube live chat box on your screen. And also you can do it via our Twitter handle, which is @InsightsNCL. So on Twitter, we are @InsightsNCL. And I'll be able to field your question to Shahidha after the lecture at about 6 o'clock. Here to introduce tonight's lecture is member of the committee, my colleague in politics, Dr Matt Davies.
Hello, and welcome to tonight's Insights Virtual Lectures, Newcastle University's Public Lectures series. My name is Matt Davies, and I'm a senior lecturer in international political economy here at Newcastle University. It is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Shahidha Bari from the London College of Art, University of the Arts, London. Professor Bari works in the fields of fashion, philosophy, and visual culture. She is the presenter of BBC Radio 3's nightly Arts and Ideas program, Free Thinking, has hosted BBC Radio 4's Front Row and Saturday Review, and is a critic on BBC TV Arts. She writes for The Guardian, Frieze Art magazine, and the TLS, among others. In 2016, she was the winner of the Observer Anthony Burgess Arts Journalism Prize. She was chair of the judges for the Free Forward Prizes of Poetry in 2019 and is currently judging the Baillie Gifford Non-Fiction Prize. Professor Bari is the author of Dressed: The Secret Life of Clothes. This thoroughly engaging book is more than an analysis of clothing or fashion as objects or means of self-expression. Rather, it examines some of the most compelling philosophical questions facing us today, explored through the mediums of clothing and dressing. I hope you enjoy the lecture.
Hello, I'm Shahidha Bari. I'm a professor at London College of Fashion at the University of the Arts, London. I'm a critic and broadcaster on BBC Radio, and I'm the writer of Dressed: The Secret Life of Clothes. This talk is called Dressed: How to Think About Clothes, and it's part of the Insight series at Newcastle University. I'm going to be talking with you today about clothes and how we think about them. I'm going to share my slideshow with you now so that you can follow along the conversation with the images. The American philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson once joked that there was only one reason for dressing well, namely that dogs respect it and will not attack you. That's a very good reason indeed. But in this lecture, I'll be arguing that however you feel about clothes, whether you love them, can joke about them, or never give them a second thought, now is the time to take them seriously. In an age of ecological and existential crisis, we might think clothes the least significant thing in the world, but I think they are deeply implicated in those things, existential and ecological matters. And actually, I'm interested in how thinking philosophically about our clothes might help us to understand ourselves and our relationships and our responsibilities. Let me start, though, with how I experience clothes. And this is a little bit from my book. When I listen closely in a crowd, I am conscious of the synthetic rustle of a jacket's lining as it grazes against an acrylic jumper, the crackle and quick hum of a zip as it zooms up to a neck, the pleasing clatter of an assortment of heels. I know precisely the smart smack of a leather sole against a solid floor. When the noise of voices, traffic and TV subside, you'll hear it too. A cloud of inchoate sounds, the murmur of tangled fibres as they brush against surfaces of all kinds. When a sweater snags on a door handle or a button dangles from a dangerously loosened thread, our clothes pointedly remind us that they are there. They are always there, these wordless witnesses to our lives. My eye is easily caught by a stranger's coat in a train carriage. My hand is prone to drifting absently through an array of textures. My brain is readily disengaged from the task at hand and inclined instead to wander about the sympathies and sensibilities made visible in the things that people wear. But perhaps the understanding won by this mode of wandering is not always wasted, and that this form of engagement with the world, well, it might be humane, responsive, and thoughtful too. To care about our clothes is to care about the people who make and wear them too. Each time we feel ourselves distracted by the colour of someone's cardigan or we straighten a friend's crooked tie, our clothes compel us to concede how susceptible we are to each other. Some people love clothes. Making and wearing of clothes is an art form for them, and it's indicative of their discernment. For others, clothes fulfill a function or provide a uniform, rarely meriting a thought beyond the requisite specifications of decency, or the regulation of temperature and the utterly unremarkable meeting of social mores. But dress is about memory, it's about meaning and intimacy. So how could we ever deny that in clothes we are connected to each other and to other places in complicated and unyielding ways? The pleasures of dress come easily. They come in the unexpected thickness of velvet into which our fingers can sink, or a skinny knitted tie the exact colour of moss. Clothes can work upon us quickly. The suit that commands our attention with the authority it emanates, the fluorescent vest that warns us of the hazard from which we must swerve, the gown whose golden lustre summons our eye like a sunbeam in a darkened room. But the ubiquity of clothes means we can be careless of them too. We rarely think to take the things we wear and hold them up to the light, inspecting them as objects of intellectual inquiry. It's true that in moments of crisis, what we wear can feel like the most trivial of concerns. But isn't it curious that so many of our most heated cultural disputes should circle around the right to wear particular clothes in particular circumstances? Think only of the dresses claimed by trans women, or the near constant state of anxiety over the visibility of the Islamic veil in Europe, or the length of skirt regularly rebuked in cases of sexual assault. In our clothes, we see our larger social crises play out, and right now, as we emerge from the COVID-19 crisis, our concerns have circled remarkably often around the matter of clothes. Think about the multitude of masks which have emerged in every variety and which are now so routinely stuffed in our coat pockets when we cautiously head out for the day. But think also of things like the work shoes that we've had to put aside while we have been doing our jobs from home, or, more importantly, the scandal of PPE and its scarcity. And how could we forget, alongside our uniformed nurses and doctors, the nobility of our postmen and supermarket assistants who've continued to enable the normality of our once normal life, even through this crisis? How could we have ever passed them so unthinkingly in our old lives? And will we ever look at those uniforms again without a deep wave of gratitude? This is an image by Carolyn Chow, and it's an ironic image. It's an image that reflects on utility, on wastefulness, and the apparent frivolousness of fashion. And it was constructed in response to the current COVID-19 crisis. I think it's intended to be comic too, mocking our frantic toilet paper shortages and the rush to buy thermometers. You'll see that the stiletto heel is made by the thermometer. But underlying this image is an idea that after this crisis, fashion must have to think about how it goes forward, what its uses are, what the uses beauty might be in a state of crisis. What strikes me with all the examples I've listed, veils, trans dress, the street harassment that can come with wearing a skirt, even PPE, is how the undeniable politics of dress illuminates a paradox. We dismiss dress as the most superficial of subjects, but we return to it again and again in the most urgent debates of our time. What I mean to say here is that life happens in clothes. We are dressed. And in all parts of culture, literature, music, film, and art, we find the representation of clothes. They can be ordinary and unremarkable, or glamorous and arresting, but they are there. And reflecting on these representations might encourage us to truly see our clothes, better understanding how they function and what they mean to us. And we must do that because those objects, those dresses and dinner jackets, our running shoes and ratty coats, are also where we might find parts of our deepest internal life. Perhaps we could find in dress a way of apprehending the world and seeing in it an expression of ideas. We are everywhere surrounded by ideas. For the most part, we unthinkingly suppose that they're found in the form of books and poems, buildings and paintings, philosophical propositions or mathematical deductions. These are forms of knowledge expressed in the mode of language, number and diagram. But what if clothes could be understood as ideas too, as fully formed and eloquent as any poem, painting or equation? What if in clothes the world could come to us, opening up like the tug of a thread, unraveling like the frayed edge of a sleeve? What if our clothes were not simply reflective of our personalities, indicative of our banal preferences for grey over green, but more deeply imprinted with the ways human beings have lived, a material record of our experiences and an expression of our ambition? Could it be possible to understand the world in these felt truths, in the perfect geometry of a notched lapel or the orderly measures of a pleated skirt? For all the abstract and elevated formulations of selfhood and the soul, interior life is so often clothed. Our memories retain the texture and forms of dress. My own childhood replays itself as a jumble of sense impressions, often in the colour and shape of clothes. Most unforgettably, an emerald green winter coat, fur-lined, hooded and belted, worn to the circus one afternoon, its silhouette so perfect that every coat afterwards has been a vain attempt at recovering it, catching at it like a dream. But in real, everyday clothes allow us to declare our place in the world, our confidence and belonging. If we think that is true, perhaps we are also labouring under a deception. We select our clothes painstakingly sometimes, as though they didn't ruthlessly appoint us, indifferent to our intentions and contrary to our will, presenting us in entirely different ways than we intend. Old, favoured clothes can be loyal like lovers to our cause, when newer ones can dazzle and deceive us. There is a naivety in the perilous ways that we trust in clothes, because dress never promises to indemnify us, neither from external assault nor internal anguish. With our skin turned to sunlight, some of us exult in exposure, as though unclothed we would be closer to true, free reality. Ian Forster, misquoting Henry Thoreau, wryly cautions us to mistrust all enterprises that require new clothes. He has the slogan scrawled on a wardrobe belonging to the soulful George Emerson in A Room with a View, although there is another kind of closetedness we might read into Forster's own Edwardian elegance too. What I mean to say here is that our clothes can provide a refuge, acting as a canopy under which we shelter our most secret agonies. When despair echoes deep inside, how we dress can help us pacify and dull pain. A blazer and slacks somehow allay our vulnerability. But to trust that our clothes will keep our secrets, well, that is a seduction in itself. Clothes can be the disguise in which we dissolve, the camouflage that allows us to keep something of ourselves in reserve, as though the only thing we are and own is that which we refuse to articulate in our outerwear. Or else they enable us to acknowledge our responsiveness to life, and we demonstrate it in the deft and quirky ways that we fix a belt, hang a tie, or roll a sleeve. The clothes we love are like friends. They bear the softness of wear, skimming the various planes of our bodies, recalling the proportions that they seem almost to have learned by memory and habit. There are certain clothes that we long for and into which our limbs pour as soon as we find a private moment. The jumper in which you at last exhale at the close of day. The t-shirt that is the only thing pressed between you and your lover through the long hours of the night. We need not be the sort that wear our hearts on our sleeves for our clothes to already know everything we might say and many things for which we could never find words. We are bound up with things and the people to whom they belong or refer. To engage thoughtfully with things like clothes is to acknowledge the nature of objects and our utter entanglements with them. Isn't it possible that what we are could in some way be dispersed through the stuff that we own? Objects are imbued with the lives of those they serve, nicked as they are by incident, worn by habit, and warmed by our touch. Our clothes are the closest things of all. For Karl Marx, clothes perfectly epitomized the mystification of objects that he detected as symptomatic of modern culture. When he described the world in the language of labour and economy and capital, his treatise of 1867, it was a coat that exemplified the distorted nature of all commodities in a capitalist society. This he understood firsthand. Down on his luck one summer, he deposited his gentleman's overcoat with a pawnbroker and found himself barred entry to the reading rooms of the British Museum without the appropriate attire. What was it about objects like coats that they could so magically open doors and bestow permissions? All commodities, including coats, it seemed to him, were mysterious things, loaded with significance, drawing their value not from the labour invested in their production, but instead from the abstract, often ugly and always competitive social relations of capitalism. Commodities, as Marx understood it, were alienated from the workers who made them. He observed how the mundane and repetitive making of such objects exhausted a worker's will, drained their vivacity, and he noted too the perversity with which a commodity could, in turn, appropriate and imitate the qualities of a human being, as though they possessed a diabolical life of their own. What do I mean by that? Clothes present this awful mimicry of human beings with a particular acuity. Think of the swaggering brio of new trainers with their insouciantly swishing insignias, or the dress that seems in possession of its own flirtatious personality as it swings on a store hanger, or the dangerously vertiginous heels that speak of a leisurely life without exertion, worlds away from that of the worker who made them. Garments enter the market seemingly untouched. The prints of the working hands through which they have passed have been wiped clean. Marx condemned this blind, unthinking attachment to objects, the all-consuming commodity fetishism of modern culture. He derived the term from the Portuguese Chiso, meaning charm or sorcery, referring specifically to the West African practice of object worship witnessed by 15th century sailors. To the fetish, worshippers could attribute the kinds of magical properties that such objects did not possess in reality. In the same way, modern capitalism, it seemed to Marx, traded on the supernatural life of objects. And clothes do elicit a kind of false idolatry. We sing the praises of shoes, dresses, jackets, and bags as though they were in possession of an inherent power, a spirit or a soul. We attribute to them stories and character and blot out their real origins, the hardships of mass production, and the working conditions from which they come. The things that we wear bear the touch of the people who construct them. Marx theorized this in the 19th century, but the truth of it is as pressing for us now as it was for him then. As the rapid production cycles of fast fashion render our garments increasingly disposable, it seems more important than ever to pause and to reflect on our clothes. If our clothes mean something to us, so too must the people who make them. And if we are to reshape the fashion and textiles industry for a sustainable future, then we must believe that there is more to our clothes than at first appears. But what about appearance itself? When we are overly concerned with our appearance, we hazard accusations of narcissism. In the ancient Greek story, Narcissus is the prettiest youth with glossy hair and an ivory neck. Driven to distraction by the beauty reflected back to him in a woodland pool, he turns inward and away from life. His error is partly vanity, but mainly stupidity. He is the unthinking idiot, unable to recognize how the water only presents his own image back to him. He lends his unhappy name to a pathological self-centeredness. Perhaps narcissism is only a naive version of self-consciousness, the self-reflection which philosophy has directed us to for centuries. And seeing ourselves, whether literally or metaphorically, somehow finding a way to hold ourselves up to our own inspection, is a profound task. The narcissists need not be stupidly self-absorbed. They can possess a vigilant and critical form of self-consciousness. They can be wry and ironic. When we fashion ourselves artfully and attentively, we are open to accusations of vanity and pretension. But the ability to imagine ourselves outside of ourselves is an important philosophical strategy. To reflect on the ways in which we are seen is also to pose questions about authenticity. How far are we able to present our inward selves with outward accuracy? And are there ever any moments that we make ourselves real or true to others? Seeing ourselves can be a burden too, of course. This is made manifest in the dutiful ways we self-regulate, assessing our appearance against exacting ideals of beauty, propriety, and age. Our can be cruel, forcing us to confront our everyday attrition and mortality. When we dress, we see our bodies as mutable things, not always within the limits of our control. This is painful, perhaps, but it is a vulnerability we all share, and as soon as we extend our imagination to the possibility of others, we form the basis of ethical relationships. When we disconsolately lament our fluctuating weight, our washed-out skin, and our tired clothes, the kindness we deny ourselves, we might extend more sympathetically to others, with the understanding of our own imperfections. Are these kinds of self-reflections always wasteful? We are accustomed to the idea of a contract-based culture of rights and responsibilities in which we abide by laws and fulfill obligations. But we might also think about the ways in which civic society is predicated on ideas of self-cultivation, not far removed from narcissism. We can care for the self, as the ancient Greeks once advised. This is what the French philosopher Michel Foucault contemplated towards the end of his life, his body pitilessly ravaged by age-related illness. To take care of oneself is to attend with great concern to every aspect of one's being, he says, taking pains with one's holdings and one's health alike. Self-care can take the form of writing, reading, eating, and exercising, he lists. And in these activities, we cultivate in ourselves a dignity that we might attribute to all human beings. Rather than being inward like Narcissus, we might be selves that turn out to the world, open to the inquiry and engagement of others. This is self-care not of moneyed individualistic egotism, but a mode of well-being that is based on a collective vision of society and our obligations to it. Caring for myself is not a self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, declares the Black feminist poet and activist Audre Lorde in the epilogue to her book, A Burst of Light. Self-care is an act of political warfare. Self-care here is not an excess of vanity, but a way to insist on your own value in an oppressive culture that is disinclined to prize your particular body and being. Our acts of self-care are most powerful of all in a society that insists that we are not worthy of it. Working with a group of South African activists in the struggle against apartheid, Lorde recalls with tender detail how the women are, she writes, sewing, sweeping the dirt ground of the yard, hanging out clothes in the sunlight at the edge of the enclosure, washing, combing each other's hair. Later, in her own struggle with cancer, she reasserts her sense of responsibility for attending my health. I cannot simply hand over that responsibility to anybody else, she explains, since acts of self-care are crucial strategies in my battle for living. They also provide me with important prototypes for doing battle in other arenas of my life. We care for ourselves, because if not us, then who? The dignity that we grant ourselves, we realize, can extend to all others equally. And the most profound parts of our lives, the intellectual inquiries that preoccupy and the moral questions that trouble, none of that can be abstracted from the bodily forms we inhabit and the social conditions in which we subject. But increasingly, fashion itself has become the source of suffering and hardship. It is a global industry worth $2.4 trillion a year, and it accounts for nearly 20% of industrial water pollution and 10% of carbon emissions. Of more than 100 billion items of clothing produced each year, 20% will go unsold to landfill or incineration. The environmental consequences of fashion and its disregard for labour rights and working conditions have been apparent since the invention of 19th century cotton mills and lock-stitch sewing machines. We can see it too in the development of department stores and the proliferation of exploitative labour. And it continues to be catastrophic in contemporary times, responsible for the deadliest structural failure accident in modern human history. The Rana Plaza incident in Dhaka, Bangladesh, is a damning indictment of the fashion industry. More recently, while many of us have had the luxury of working from home and maintaining social distance, garment workers have continued to labour in overcrowded factories in both Bangladesh and India before being summarily dismissed without severance, many of them left to walk enormous distances home to their rural villages. The fact is that 6 of the world's richest people own fashion and clothing conglomerates. We buy 400% more clothing than we did 20 years ago. And it is undeniable that fashion itself upholds a value system which is often exclusively white, misogynistic, body-shaming, and invested in strict gender binaries. All of this might make us want to wash our hands of fashion, to dismiss it as a deeply immoral industry. But boycotting fashion, dismissing the matter of what we wear, overlooks what's so profound and inclusive about our clothes. If we are troubled by our age of disposable consumption and overproduction, we might valiantly try to buy less frequently and more responsibly, repairing and recycling, supporting fairer pay and protesting working conditions. Those are good things to do. But we might also challenge how we think about dress, recalibrating our relationship with clothes by giving them the due respect they demand, refusing to relegate them to superficiality. If we buy compulsively, we might ask what inner emptiness it is that dress seeks to fill, and for which it is never enough. If we have some sense of how deeply life is lived in clothes, we should ask how to provide better for those tasked with the work of manufacturing them. If the world is in our clothes, it follows that we should care about who makes them and how. At some point in the day, you will open up a wardrobe, pull out a drawer, or rifle through a laundry basket. You will button up a jacket or tug off your trainers. You will snatch up your wallet or rummage in a pocket. You will see someone in the street wearing a shirt the colour of a July sky, a coat woven in the perfectly interlocked pattern of herringbone, a skirt in a silk made iridescent by the glance of a certain light. You will find a tie in the exact hue that brings out the unseen inflections of your eye colour, the suit that imparts to you a seriousness you never knew you had, the dress that draws you a different silhouette. Our clothes are ordinary and exhilarating. We wear them to make ourselves understood, even though there is no promise of understanding. They envelop us as though we were each of us apart, and they entangle us because we are always connected. Thank you for joining me for this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it.
And now we're joined by our speaker, Shahidha. Welcome to Insights Public Lectures. Thank you for a wonderful lecture. Imagine the applause there would be if you were in the Cursor Auditorium with us now.
Thank you. I would.
I was listening to that, I was struck. I mean, is it too early to say whether there's been a COVID consequence on dress? Because so much of what we're doing now is only involving seeing people from the shoulder up.
Yes, it's not too early. In fact, people were asking me it back in April and are still asking me yesterday. It's a funny thing for me because I spend my life telling people to take clothes seriously, largely for reasons of sustainability. And actually what the surprising thing about the COVID crisis is that I think it has compelled people to think about their clothes, actually. I think that there are very obvious ways in which we've been thinking about it. We've been thinking about wearing gloves and wearing masks, of course, and lots of us have been feeling very passionate about the inadequate provision of personal protective clothing for medical personnel. Actually, my brother is a doctor who works in Bolton, and he was working in a COVID ward, and I remember phoning him up the first week of his work, and I said, "Do you have PPE?" And he said, "I have a paper apron." And my heart sank. So, I mean, one of the things I argue in my book is that we think that clothes aren't serious, but time and time again, we find them at the center of some of our most urgent debates. And actually, one of the things I remind people is that Primo Levi, who wrote a memoir of Auschwitz famously, he said, remember when there is war, the first thing is shoes. And second is eating, because if you have shoes, you can run and survive, but you must have shoes. And one of the funny things I've been thinking about is, there've been funny things. I've been watching my friends and my colleagues on Zoom meetings like this one, and it's become increasingly hard for us to distinguish our private lives from our work lives. And I found it immensely moving, actually, to be in those Zoom meetings where a colleague has baby sick down their top because they're doing their childcare as well as, doing their teaching. It's been humanizing for lots of us to realize that we're human beings as well as colleagues. But the other thing I've thought about often is that lots of people haven't been at home. Lots of people have been going to work. And those are largely people who wear uniforms. And I don't just mean doctors and nurses who we know to venerate, but I think a lot about supermarket workers. And I don't think I will ever look at people who I will never look at somebody in a Sainsbury's uniform ever again and take them for granted. I think that we owe the everydayness of our everyday lives that they've managed to sustain for us is this enormous debt of gratitude we will always owe them. And we're accustomed to taking uniforms for granted and ignoring them. But I think we might be reappraising, how key our key workers are. So yeah, I think that there are so many ways that we're going to have to think about clothes and are thinking about clothes through the COVID crisis.
Thinking afresh in all sorts of ways. We have lots of interesting questions. The first one I have on screen is from Rebecca, who asks, would you say that the type and style of clothing that a person wears informs of their personality?
Well, I think this is what fashion theorists and bloggers and journalists have always said, that actually what we wear represents our identity, or is an attempt to make visible our identity. And I don't deny that's true. I think you just have to think of the person wearing their Newcastle United t-shirt or a Ramones t-shirt. But one of the things I say in the book is that a person is not the sum of their the Ramones t-shirt is not the sum of a person, that the idea that we could express ourselves in our clothes fully is a fiction, it's an illusion. And one of the things I'm most interested in is the things that we don't know we're saying in our clothes, the things that we don't intend to say. And I always say, I'm not a fashionista particularly, I'm not particularly stylish, but I love watching people who dress flamboyantly and well. But I'm as interested in the person in the beige t-shirt and the scuffed shoes on the bus as the person in the Dior dress. I think even when you're not trying to say something in your clothes, very often you are saying something. And that really interests me. The things that we don't know we're saying in our clothes is as interesting as the things we think we are saying.
We have a question from YouTube. It's a really exciting approach to the field. Where do you think more research needs to be done in the philosophy of dress?
In the philosophy of dress, I don't think there is a philosophy of dress. I think that one of the difficulties is that dress studies and philosophy are two distinct disciplines, and there are lots of reasons for that. One of the reasons is that philosophy has always been an austere and severe discipline, and I dare I say it's gatekept by men, and that one of the reasons that fashion and the body, certainly I think in lots of ways, hasn't made itself felt in philosophy is because it's often been regarded as a feminine concern. And so in my first chapter of the book, I talk about how Kant dismisses it as a folly. Nietzsche says that it's a superficial concern and a woman's concern, although I think superficial concerns are very interesting to Nietzsche. But then I try to recover some of the ways in which we could think philosophically about dress. And often lots of women, Simone de Beauvoir is my absolute favorite. Simone de Beauvoir is sort of slightly dismissive of clothes. She thinks it's one of those things that maybe distracts women, but she also says that the body is not a thing, it is a situation. It is our grasp on the world and an outline for our projects. And when I think about Simone de Beauvoir's life, she was remarkably stylish, and she used to wear her ski wear in bed to save on heating bills, and she could never be bothered to do her hair. This was during the occupation of France, so she would wear those turbans. And so I think there's a reason why philosophy hasn't been interested in dress, because slightly concerned, seems to be because they're concerned with women, and I think that's a misconception. But I also think dress studies has often been seduced by ideas of identity and subculture. And those are good ways of studying dress. But I think I'm trying to think more conceptually about I'm trying to think about clothes as ideas in the same way as you might think of a poem or an equation or an artwork as an idea. I think clothes can be ideas too. And it does strike me that we live, and for most of the time we are dressed. And there is no way that the real and important things of our life, our experiences, could not be imprinted in the things that we wear. And we are the only creatures that dress. And so that seems to me a really remarkable thing. And I'm hoping that there's going to be more work that thinks more conceptually about dress. But to answer the question, the most important work that has to happen in dress is about sustainability. And I think one of the reasons we encourage people to think about the ecological crisis around dress is to value dress. And I'm really interested in the kinds of studies that encourage people to think about what they're wearing and why clothes matter. Because if you can care about clothes, you might start to care about the people who make them. And that's what's most important to me.
We have a very practical question from Rachel, who asks what tips you might give us as an audience about thinking more carefully about our clothes. I learnt to sew a few years ago, and it has taught me a lot.
Oh, well done. I think that's a brilliant thing to do. I don't go in for tips. I always say I'm not Trini and Susanna from that marvelous and yet horrendous 90s program telling you what to wear. I met Trini once, and she was as remarkable as you would think. So I don't go in for tips. I'm not interested in telling you what you should wear, but the idea that we might have suggestions about how we think about our clothes is a good one. And I think learning to sew, altering and learning to mend is such a great thing to do, not just for reasons of sustainability, although that's really a great thing to do, but I'm a very tiny person. I'm barely 5 foot. Nothing ever fits me. And I find that the fact that when I was a child, my mother taught me to sew, and I could manage a sewing machine. It was incredibly liberating to be able to go shopping and be able to see a garment and think, well, I can transform that. That doesn't fit me. That isn't the right shape, but I could put a seam here and a dart here, and it will be magical. And I repair clothes for my friends and family all the time. My husband is extremely vain and a real dandy. I don't think he'll mind me exposing him. So I think, it's a great act of tenderness to be able to tend to somebody else's clothes because you understand their form. But the way that we think about our clothes, I think this perhaps is a difficult thing to say. I think lots of us are trying to buy less and make things buy better quality, and we're being encouraged to make, do and mend, and those are all good things to do. I try to buy secondhand nearly all the time now. I try to buy very little in the high street, and I find that's actually perfectly feasible. But I do think this is a slightly difficult thing to say, but I also think that it doesn't devolve to individuals. We're really accustomed to berating young women in particular for fast fashion, for buying too much and ruining our planet. But that's not what it is. I think one of the things we have to recognize in the industry, that it isn't so much overconsumption as overproduction. The reason we buy so much is because so much is produced for us. The most important thing we can do is lobby our government and challenge industry about the way that it exploits our natural resources, and it exploits labor. And so there's a more fundamental challenge to industry and government about the way that the fashion industry works. Although, the things that we do make a difference, but it's a much bigger picture. And it's important not to blame young women, I think, for this crisis. We're all in it.
That in part goes to answer the next question from Hope, but I'll put them a bit of scope to expand on it as well. Hope asks, would you say our relationship with clothes is changing now that we're becoming more aware of the climate crisis and shopping sustainably? And of course, it reflects on, I also wondered about the shift to online, how much that's impacting on the kind of things you're describing.
It's a really complicated picture, but I certainly think things are changing, partly because I find myself elbowing for room in secondhand shops now in a way that I didn't 10 years ago. And, over the last 20 years has become a real vogue for secondhand and vintage. And we are, I think generally, many of us are more socially conscious. And in the lecture, I gave some really stark statistics. This is a global industry that's worth $2.4 trillion a year, and it is responsible for 10% of carbon emissions in the air and 20% of industrial water pollution in the latest figures. Of more than 100 billion items of clothing that are produced each year, 100 billion items of clothing produced each year, 20% will go unsold to landfill or incineration. And those are the kinds of statistics, I've memorized them, and I think everybody should. Those are the kinds of statistics that should make us take our head in our hands. I think our attitudes are changing. It's complicated because I think there's a reason why people buy, particularly young women, but all sorts of people. I think that many people find that there is some hole in life, some emptiness that buying clothes fulfills or tries to fill. And we have to think about why that is. But whether online shopping, the tilt to online shopping will remedy things is hard to say, because online shopping incurs other costs. We have enormous returns from online shopping because you can't touch the garments. You are more likely to order a silk shirt that does not quite feel like what you think it will feel when it arrives at your house, and you will return it. And it incurs the carbon emissions of the delivery, the plastic packaging, all of those things. So we have more returns, more emissions. It's a complicated scenario. But I think one of the things that digital might do is we might develop more technologies that allow us to replicate touch. And we might also develop forecasting software so that we know that the red jumper is going to sell more than the black jumper, so we produce more of the red jumper and fewer of the black jumper. There are all sorts of terrible algorithms that are going to calculate the way that we buy, and that might be useful in a funny way for our commitment to sustainability, because we're used to berating technology, arsenic in dyes and cotton mills for polluting. I mean, the 19th century industrial textile machine was a great polluter. And in a funny way, we've ended up in a situation where technology might start to provide some of the solutions to our ecological problems. It's very exciting, but also extremely complicated picture.
Peter asks a very interesting question related to that, which is how far is this one of the reasons why we are dressing down so much? The psychology of dressing down as a consequence of social and cultural fears.
Yeah, that seems like a complicated question, and I hope I've understood it. I mean, there is, do we mean by dressing down that we're becoming more casual?
He asks further, how does the environment affect our decisions to dress up or down?
Right. Okay. I think many people are thinking about this. I think that many people are buying less and mending more. I think people are buying consciously or trying to. I also think that lots of fashion brands are exploiting our susceptibility to conscious fashion and not necessarily doing more than paying lip service to it. I think I think that there is another way to think about dressing down. I think there is an idea that the formal register of our dress culture in general, and it certainly in Britain in the West, has gone down a notch. That, you know, casual Fridays is casual Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday now as well. And there is one way of understanding that, which is something about the production of mass fashion is democratizing. That this is the argument for Primark in one way, that why shouldn't everybody of every economic background have access to the latest designs and colors and ranges? And there is something about that too, which I think is interesting. I always think, I know that the picture around fashion and the fashion industry can feel bleak in terms of sustainability and waste, and the sexism and misogyny and racism of the fashion industry as a system is a deeply problematic set of values. But the one thing I hold on to is that human beings have never looked more different than they do right now in human history. That's something to do with mass production, but it's also something to do with our access to global cultures. And I think that is a remarkable thing. We complain about hipsters, that kids dress all the same. But the fact is, people have never looked more different than they do right now in this moment of history. And I marvel and celebrate that.
This wasn't rehearsed, but the last question we have actually asks from Liv. Do you think clothing is universal across all genders? Nowadays, many more men are wearing feminine clothing and vice versa with women.
I think this is such an exciting frontier. I can't claim to know much about it. I have amazing colleagues at London College of Fashion who write about the frontier of menswear and how menswear is changing. And I think there is a real question for the fashion industry, at least at the high end, whereby we produce conventionally menswear and womenswear ranges very almost didactically, and we're seeing this increasing fluidity in stuff. I mean, there's always been a kind of gender bending, a queering of fashion. Fashion has always been sympathetic to queer culture, but there is a kind of a dispersing of those boundaries about what a woman should look like, what a man should look like, and those categories themselves. And I think it's such an amazing and exciting thing. And fashion has to catch up. I don't think we can have menswear and womenswear ranges in the same way. We have to think of new ways of encountering this brave new world. I think it's so exciting. And one of the most interesting parts of it is that we're talking about a globalized menswear culture. We're not just talking about menswear in London and Paris and Milan. We're talking about menswear as it's developing in India, in Nigeria, and all of these influences are transforming what it looks like to dress as a person of any gender or no gender.
A very fruitful area for teaching and research, as you've been saying. That was really wonderful. Thank you very much, Shahidha. There would again be applause at this point, where we in our usual venue. Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much.
Such a pleasure. Well, thank you for having me. Amazing questions. Thank you so much for listening and asking.
It was wonderful. We're very keen for your feedback. If any of the glitches or anything which may have impaired or anything we could do to improve our performance, please do let us know either through Twitter or our email address, public.lectures@ncl.ac.uk. That's public.lectures@ncl.ac.uk. Our next virtual lecture will be on Thursday, and that's one of our alums, Danny Dorling, the social geographer, who will be speaking on the subject of what's good for the planet. It's the slowdown, why it's good for the planet and for the economy. So some threads, as it were, with this evening's lecture as well. So I'll end just with another grateful thanks to our speaker, Shahidha. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.